You can fire a man, you can fire a whole crew, you can throw cash at a problem until your bank account bleeds, but there is one thing on a job site you can never, ever fire: gravity. Gravity doesn't care about your tax bracket, it doesn't care about your deadlines, and when arrogance tries to negotiate with physics, physics always collects its toll. Where are you watching from today? Tell me in the comments. I'm about to show you exactly what happens when a millionaire decides that expert crane riggers are just a line item he can cross out to save a buck. The morning air up on Ridgeview Estates tasted like pine needles and expensive dirt. At 58 years old, my knees could predict a cold front better than the local meteorologist, and they were aching as I walked the perimeter of the freshly poured concrete foundation. My name is Anthony Ward. For 3 decades, I've made my living doing one highly specific, incredibly unforgiving job. I rig heavy things to cranes so they don't fall out of the sky. I crouch down, wiping a layer of frost off my tape measure, and check the distance from the foundation wall to the massive outrigger pads of the 200-ton mobile crane humming idly behind me. Inside the cab, Mac, the operator, was drinking coffee from a steel thermos, trusting me to do the math that would keep his machine from tipping over. Anthony, I looked up. Pete, the site foreman, was jogging down the slope. He was a good man, but he had the perpetual nervous energy of a guy who spent 12 hours a day trying to keep a demanding boss happy. Today he looked pale. "What's the word, Pete?" I asked, and standing up and brushing the damp earth from my reinforced knees. "August is texting me every 5 minutes," Pete said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead despite the chill. "He wants to know why we aren't hooked up to the first module yet. The lowboy trucks have been sitting at the staging area at the bottom of the hill since 6 this morning." I pulled a battered notebook from my high-visibility vest. "They're sitting down there because the wind is currently blowing at 22 miles an hour over this ridge, Pete. And more importantly, because I haven't finished calculating the ground-bearing pressure for this slope. August Watson's house is going to weigh roughly 180,000 pounds when it's all said and done. If the earth gives way under Mac's outriggers, this crane goes tumbling down into the valley, and takes half the foundation with it." Pete sighed, running a hand over his hard hat. I know, but August doesn't care about ground pressure. He cares about his daily rental fees. He says every hour those trucks sit at the bottom of the hill, he's bleeding money." "Better his wallet bleeds than one of my guys," I said softly, capping my pen. I looked out over the sprawling, multi-million-dollar plot. August Watson had made his fortune in the tech software, a world where you could just press undo if you made a mistake. He treated construction the same way. He was building a massive, ultra-luxury modular home. Instead of building it stick by stick on site, the house had been built in massive pieces in a factory, trucked in, and now needed to be hoisted into the air and stitched together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. "Then tell August we'll bring the first module up the hill in 20 minutes, I told Pete. "But tell him I need to inspect the payload before we even think about dropping the crane block." Pete nodded, pulling out his phone. "He's on his way up here now. Just brace yourself, Anthony. He's in a mood." I just nodded, turning back to my numbers. The math never lied. The math didn't care about August Watson's mood. The heavy groan of diesel engines echoed off the mountain as the first lowboy trailer crept over the crest of the hill. It carried Module A, the primary lower section of August Watson's dream home. The truck hissed to a halt, the air brakes locking. I walked up to the side of the trailer, pulling my safety glasses down over my eyes. From the outside, it just looked like a giant wooden box wrapped in thick white weather-resistant plastic. But I had the manufacturer's blueprints in my back pocket. I unfolded the thick paper, cross-referencing the structural schematics with the giant block of lumber and drywall sitting on the trailer. "All right," I muttered to myself, tracing a finger over the lines. "What are we looking at?" Pete asked, coming up beside me. "A massive headache," I replied. I pointed to the left side of the blueprint. "Look here. This module isn't an empty shell. It's fully finished on the inside. This left half contains the entire master bathroom and the custom kitchen. We're talking a cast iron soaking tub, floor-to-ceiling imported marble tile, solid quartz countertops, and a 1,000-pound commercial refrigerator." Pete squinted at the paper. "Okay, I slid my finger to the right side of the drawing. "And this side is the open-concept living room. It's nothing but air, drywall, and some glass windows. Do you see the problem, Pete?" Pete looked back at the giant white box on the trailer. Understanding slowly dawned on his face. The weight isn't even. Not even close, I said, shaking my head. If I rig this thing with 4 equal-length cables to a standard square spreader bar, the moment the crane lifts it, the heavy side is going to drop like a stone. It'll tilt at a 30-degree angle, the drywall will crack, the windows will shatter, and the frame will warp. The center of gravity isn't in the middle of the box. It's heavily offset to the left. I pulled out my radio. Mac, you copy? The radio crackled. Go ahead, Anthony. We've got an asymmetrical load. At roughly 42,000 pounds, heavily biased to the port side. A standard pick won't work. We need the adjustable modular spreader bar, and I'm going to need specialized synthetic slings in variable lengths to compensate for the center of gravity. There was a pause on the radio. Anthony, we didn't bring the adjustable bar. Boss man August refused to pay the rental fee for it. Said the standard fixed frame was fine. I froze. I slowly lowered the radio and turned to look at Pete. Tell me you're joking. I put the adjustable spreader gear on the required equipment list 3 weeks ago. Pete looked at his boots. August crossed it off. He said it was an $8,000 upcharge for gear we didn't need. He told the crane company just to bring the standard frame. I felt a tight knot form in my jaw. Rigging an asymmetrical load of this magnitude without an adjustable spreader bar wasn't just difficult, it was incredibly dangerous. It required precise mathematical adjustments of the wire ropes, chain come-alongs to manually adjust the center point, and hours of tedious balancing. You can't lift this with a fixed frame, Pete, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Not safely, not without risking the load twisting in the air. Then we have a problem, a sharp, impatient voice rang out behind us. I turned. Striding through the mud in a pair of spotless designer boots was August Watson. August Watson looked exactly like a man who spent his life barking orders at people who were too afraid of losing their jobs to tell him he was wrong. He was in his early 50s, and wearing a tailored half-zip sweater and a silver watch that cost more than my work truck. He looked completely out of place against the backdrop of excavators, mud, and heavy machinery, but he carried himself like he owned the mountain, which, technically, he did. I'm paying $3,000 an hour for that crane to sit there, August said, not offering a handshake as he marched up to us. He pointed a manicured finger at the module on the trailer. Why is my house still on the truck, Ward? Good morning to you too, Mr. Watson, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. The house is still on the truck, because the gear I requested to safely lift this specific module wasn't delivered. I'm told you removed the adjustable spreader bar from the equipment order. August rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it made my teeth grind. I removed it because it was an exorbitant waste of money. $8,000 to rent some metal pipes? I'm not a fool, Anthony. I know when contractors are trying to pad the bill. It's not padding the bill, I explained, gesturing to the blueprint still in my hand. It's physics. One side of your house is filled with marble and cast iron. The other side is empty air. The center of gravity is entirely offset. If we try to lift this with a standard square frame, it will not lift level. So make the cables on one side shorter, August snapped, as if he were explaining simple addition to a toddler. It's not rocket science. You hook it up, you pick it up, you put it down. I took a deep breath. It actually is a lot like rocket science, Mr. Watson. Adjusting cable lengths without a specialized bar to account for torsion means we are relying on chains and manual come-alongs to find the perfect center point by trial and error. It takes hours to get it right, and the margin of error is virtually zero. If the load shifts in the air, the internal wooden framing will torque, your drywall will pop, your tile will crack, and the structural integrity of the module will be compromised. August stepped closer, his face turning an angry shade of red. Do not lecture me on integrity. I built a multi-million-dollar software firm from the ground up. I know how to manage projects, and I know how to manage costs. Software doesn't weigh 42,000 pounds, I replied firmly, and software doesn't fall on people. Pete took a cautious step forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. August, Anthony is the best rigger in the state. If he says we need the gear, I don't care what he says, August shouted, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet job site. Several of the carpenters working on the foundation stopped and looked over. I brought you in, Ward, because they said you were fast. Instead, you've done nothing but hold up my site with delays, phantom weather warnings, and ridiculous equipment requests. I have Donnie's crew down in the valley who will do this entire job for half your rate, and they don't whine about needing special toys to do it. I looked at August, really looked at him. I saw the pure, unfiltered hubris of a man who believed that his checkbook was a shield against reality. Donnie is a 25-year-old kid who sets air conditioning units on flat roofs, I said, my voice dropping an octave. He doesn't have the experience to rig a 40-ton asymmetrical modular home. If you let him try to balance this load with standard gear, you are asking for a catastrophe. What I am asking for, August hissed, poking a finger hard into my shoulder, is for you to do your job, hook up the module with the gear we have, and get it in the air. Now. I looked at his finger on my shoulder. Then I looked at the giant white box on the trailer. Finally, I looked August Watson dead in the eye. No. The word hung in the cold mountain air like a puff of exhaust smoke. For a moment, the only sound on the site was the low, steady idle of the 200-ton crane behind us. August Watson's hand slowly dropped from my shoulder. His face went perfectly still, and the kind of stillness that usually precedes a very expensive tantrum. "Excuse me?" he said softly. "I said no," I repeated, my voice calm, flat, and unyielding. "I am not lifting a 42,000-pound asymmetrical load with a fixed-frame spreader bar. It violates safety protocols, it violates the laws of physics, and, quite frankly, it violates common sense. You either approve the rental of the adjustable modular gear, which will take 3 hours to get up here, or I don't give Mac the signal to lift." Pete, the site foreman, was staring at me with wide eyes, looking like a man watching a lit match tumble toward an open gas can. "You don't give the signal," August repeated, stepping so close I could smell his expensive cologne. "Let's get one thing straight, Ward. You don't make the decisions here. I own this land, and I bought this house. I pay your invoice. You work for me." "I work for gravity," I said, tapping my hard hat. "And gravity says your house is going to twist in the air if we try this your way." August let out a short, harsh laugh. It was entirely devoid of humor. He turned to Pete. "Call Donnie, right now. Tell him to get his rigging crew up here immediately." Pete swallowed hard, glancing at me before looking back at August. "Mr. Watson, Donnie he's a good kid, but he's never lifted a modular home section this big. And he definitely doesn't know how to balance an offset load without the right bar." "Donnie is cheap," August snapped, pointing a finger directly in Pete's face. "And Donnie does what he's told without giving me a physics lecture. Call him." August turned back to me, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on his lips. You're fired, Ward. Pack up your gear and get off my site. I'm not paying you another dime to stand around and complain." I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I felt a familiar, hot flare of anger in my chest, the instinct to fight back, to argue, to protect the site from a catastrophic mistake. But as I stared at the absolute certainty in August Watson's eyes, the unshakable belief that his wealth made him immune to consequences, the anger suddenly vanished. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I couldn't save this man from himself, and more importantly, I suddenly realized I didn't want to. "Understood," I said quietly. I unclipped the heavy specialized two-way radio from my vest and handed it to Pete. I didn't say another word to August. I just turned and started walking toward my truck. "Yeah, that's right." "I keep walking," August yelled after me, his voice carrying over the hum of the machinery. "I've got a crew who actually wants to work. Crane guys are cheap, Ward. You aren't irreplaceable." I didn't look back. I just kept walking. My truck was parked near the edge of the staging area, a beat-up F-25, filled with heavy steel shackles, synthetic slings, and safety gear. I dropped my tailgate and began methodically unbuckling my climbing harness. As I packed my tools, another truck came tearing up the dirt access road, spitting gravel as it slammed on its brakes near the crane. It was Donnie. He hopped out, practically vibrating with eager energy, wearing a brand-new high-visibility vest and a backwards baseball cap under his hard hat. Two younger guys piled out behind him. "Mr. Watson," Donnie called out, jogging over. "Got your call. We're ready to rock." I watched them from a distance. Donnie was 25, strong as an ox, and eager to please a wealthy client. He was exactly the kind of guy August wanted, someone who wouldn't say no. I grabbed my thermos from the cab of my truck and poured a cup of coffee. I leaned against my tailgate, fully intending to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. Every construction site has a perimeter, usually marked by a thin red or yellow caution tape strung between metal posts. It's the absolute boundary, Inside the tape is the active drop zone. Outside the tape is the spectator gallery. I zipped up my heavy canvas jacket, walked over to the edge of the staging area, and deliberately stepped behind the red safety tape. I crossed my arms and stood perfectly still. I saw Pete watching me nervously from near the foundation. He knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't just loitering. I was staying to bear witness. Down by the trailer, August was pointing at the massive white module. "I want this thing in the air and set on the foundation in 20 minutes, Donnie. Can you handle that?" "Absolutely, sir," Donnie beamed, completely oblivious to the danger. "We'll get her hooked up right now." I watched as Donnie and his crew grabbed 4 standard steel wire ropes. They didn't pull out blueprints. They didn't calculate the offset weight of the marble bathroom or the cast iron tub. They just looked at the massive rectangular box and assumed the center of gravity was perfectly in the middle, like a giant shipping container. They began attaching the cables to the 4 lifting lugs on top of the module, connecting them to the heavy, square steel spreader frame hanging from the crane's massive hook block. "He's rigging it perfectly symmetrical," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. "Anthony?" I looked up. Mac, the veteran crane operator, had stepped out of his cab and walked over to the safety tape. He looked deeply troubled. "You off the clock?" Mac asked quietly, glancing back toward August. "I'm fired, Mac," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "August said I was too expensive. He wanted a cheaper option." Mac swore softly under his breath, watching Donnie scramble over the top of the module. "They're rigging it square. That box is heavier on the port side, isn't it?" "It's carrying a full custom kitchen and a marble bathroom on the left," I confirmed. "The right side is empty air." Mac paled. "If I pick that up with equal-length cables, the heavy side is going to drop the second it clears the trailer. It's going to swing." "Yes, it is," I said calmly. "And if Donnie doesn't realize it, and you keep lifting, the entire structure is going to torse under the uneven strain." "I should shut the crane down," Mac said, his hand resting on the red tape. I looked at him. "If you refuse to lift, August will fire your company, sue you for breach of contract, and bring in another operator tomorrow. Donnie is the rigger in charge now. It's his call and August's responsibility. You just do what the rigger signals. Keep your machine safe." Mac looked at me, then looked at the arrogant millionaire pacing near the trailer. He gave a slow, grim nod. "Right, I just read the signals." He walked back to his cab. I stayed behind the red tape. The tension on the site was palpable. A thick, heavy silence that settled over the crew as Donnie finished the final connections. The 4 thick steel cables ran from the corners of the massive white box up to the square spreader frame, then up to the massive hook block hanging from the boom of the crane. Donnie jumped down from the trailer, dusting off his hands. He looked extremely pleased with himself. He turned to August, giving him a confident thumbs up. "All hooked up, Mr. Watson," Donnie said brightly. "Ready to fly." August smiled, a smug, satisfied expression that he deliberately aimed in my direction. He wanted me to see how easily he had replaced me. He wanted me to watch my complicated physics be debunked by a kid with a good attitude and cheap rates. "Take it up, Donnie," August commanded. Donnie pulled his radio. "All right, Mac, let's take the slack out. Now cable up, slow." Inside the cab, I saw Mac hesitate for a fraction of a second before his hand moved the joystick. The massive diesel engine of the crane roared, a deep guttural sound that vibrated in my chest. Slowly, the thick steel cable began to spool upward. Clank, clank, clank. The heavy metal rigging hardware tightened. The 4 steel ropes running to the module went from loose and swaying to pulling taut. This was the most critical moment of any lift, taking the weight. It's the second before the load actually leaves the ground, when the crane absorbs the full mass of the object, and the cables stretch under extreme tension. This is when a good rigger watches the lines, checking for equal tension, watching how the suspension system reacts. I watched intently from behind the red tape. The cables on the left side of the module, the heavy side, carrying the marble and the cast iron, were fully taut, vibrating like guitar strings under the massive strain. But the cables on the right side, the light side, the empty living room, were still slightly slack. They weren't bearing equal weight because the center of gravity was drastically offset. Any experienced rigger would have seen it instantly. They would have yelled to stop, lowered the hook, and spent 2 hours adjusting the chain lengths with manual come-alongs to perfectly balance the load. Donnie didn't see it. He wasn't looking at the cables. He was looking at August, eager for approval. "Cables are tight," Donnie called out. "Looks good, Mr. Watson." August nodded, checking his expensive watch. "Get it in the air. I want it on the foundation before lunch." Pete, babosis bestanind, ni monbos. Face standing near the foundation walls, looked terrified. He glanced over at me, his eyes pleading. I stood perfectly still, my hands in my pockets, my face an impassive mask. I had warned them. I had been fired for warning them. Now, gravity was in charge. "All right, Mac," Donnie said into the radio, his voice cracking slightly with excitement. "Take her up, nice and smooth." The engine roared louder. The winch drums spun. I braced myself. The 42,000-pound module groaned against the trailer bed. The wood creaked, a sharp, violent sound like a tree trunk splintering in a storm. And then, the house left the earth. The instant the massive white module cleared the flatbed trailer, the laws of physics asserted their absolute, uncompromising authority. It didn't lift level. It didn't even lift close to level, with a sickening, heavy shudder that vibrated through the mud beneath my boots. The left side of the structure, the side burdened with the custom kitchen, the marble, and the cast-iron tub, dropped instantly toward the earth, while the right side, the empty living room, jerked violently upward. "Whoa! Whoa! Whoa!" Donnie screamed into his radio, his bravado evaporating in a millisecond. The entire 42,000-pound box was suspended 10 feet in the air, hanging at a terrifying 30-degree angle. It looked like a sinking ship frozen in midair. The 4 steel cables attached to the square spreader bar above it were screaming under the uneven load. The 2 cables on the heavy side were as rigid as iron bars, taking nearly the entire weight of the structure. The 2 cables on the light side were practically limp. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" August Watson roared, stepping back from the trailer as the massive tilted structure swayed slightly in the morning breeze. "Why is it crooked?" Donnie looked completely panicked. He was staring up at the tilted box, his mouth hanging open. I don't know. It's hooked up square. The cables are exactly the same length." From behind the red safety tape, I watched the disaster unfold with a cold, almost clinical detachment. I didn't say a word. I didn't point out the obvious. I just took another slow sip of my coffee. "Mac!" Donnie yelled into his radio, his voice frantic. "Set it back down! Set it down!" Inside the crane cab, Mac's face was grim. He slowly pushed the joystick forward, attempting to lower the wildly unbalanced load back onto the trailer, but the trailer was flat. The module was now angled at 30 degrees. As the heavy left side of the house came down, its reinforced wooden corner slammed hard against the steel deck of the lowboy trailer. Crack! The sound echoed off the ridge like a gunshot. The wood splintered, a sharp, violent noise that made the nearby carpenters flinch. Because the heavy corner hit first, the rest of the massive box was still suspended in the air. The crane was still holding tens of thousands of pounds of pressure on an angle. The module was literally teetering on a single point of impact, the center of gravity violently offset, the structure fighting against itself. "Stop! Stop!" August yelled, waving his arms at the crane cab. "You're breaking it! Pick it back up!" Mac instantly stopped lowering the cable. The module hung there, and suspended between the crane and the trailer deck, a massive, groaning, tilted box of immense kinetic energy waiting to release. "Get it straight!" August bellowed, turning on Donnie with a sudden, vicious fury. "Why is it crooked? Fix it!" Donnie was practically shaking. "Mr. Watson, the weight is all on one side. I used equal-length cables, but it's pulling down on the left." "Then shorten the left cables!" August screamed, his face purple with rage. "I am not paying $3,000 an hour for you to stare at a crooked box. Balance the damn thing and get it over the foundation." Donnie looked up at the massive steel spreader bar, suspended 20 feet above the slanted roof of the module. To shorten the cables now, with the load partially suspended and under immense tension, was incredibly dangerous without specialized gear. It required heavy chain come-alongs, precise manual adjustments, and an understanding of exactly how the center of gravity would shift once the adjustments were made. It required the adjustable modular spreader bar that August had refused to rent. Donnie looked over his shoulder. He looked right at me, standing calmly behind the red safety tape. His eyes were wide with a silent plea for help. I met his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply gave a slow, deliberate shake of my head, crossing my arms over my chest. I wasn't stepping over that line. Donnie swallowed hard and turned back to August. Sir, I need to bring it all the way down. I need to get chains and manually shorten the left side. It's going to take time. August stepped aggressively toward the young rigger. Nah, you will not put that module back on the truck. If you drop it back down, you have to undo the rigging and we lose another hour. You have it in the air. You figure out how to level it in the air, and you swing it over my foundation right now, or you're fired too. Donnie's face went pale. He looked at the massive, groaning structure. He looked at the furious millionaire screaming in his face. And then he made the catastrophic mistake of listening to the man who signed the checks instead of listening to the laws of physics. Mac, Donnie said into the radio, his voice trembling, take it back up. Just take it up high enough to clear the trailer, then swing it right. Pete, the site foreman, clamped his hands over his hard hat. Oh, God, he whispered. The diesel engine roared again. The thick steel cables spooled tight. And the massive hook block rose. As Mac slowly lifted the module entirely off the flatbed trailer again, the true horror of the situation became visibly, violently apparent. Hanging at a severe 30-degree angle, the heavy left side of the 42,000-pound box wasn't just dropping, it was pulling the entire structure with it. The immense weight of the marble bathroom and cast-iron kitchen was fighting against the empty air of the living room on the right side. The 4 standard lifting points on the roof were designed to be pulled straight up, evenly distributing the load. Now, they were being pulled sideways. The structure was experiencing massive torsion. It was twisting. From where I stood behind the red tape, I could literally see the massive white box beginning to warp. The rigid, a rectangular shape of the module was bowing in the middle, curving like a giant wooden bow under immense tension. Crack, snap, groan. The sounds coming from inside the white plastic wrap were horrifying. It sounded like an old wooden ship breaking apart in a storm. The thick wooden framing of the house was violently protesting against the uneven stress. Swing right, Donnie yelled frantically into his radio, clearly hoping that if he just got it over the foundation, they could drop it quickly and be done with it. Swing right, Mac! Mac began to slowly rotate the massive crane boom to the right, but as the heavy, unbalanced load began to move through the air, momentum was added to the already chaotic physics equation. The massive, heavy left side of the module swung out slightly, pulling the lighter right side with it. The entire structure was torquing. It was twisting in midair, a 40-ton corkscrew suspended 20 feet above the mud. Pop, pop, pop. The sounds were sharper now, like rapid gunfire echoing off the ridge. Inside the module, the rigid materials, the drywall, the tile, the glass windows, could not flex like the wood. They were shattering under the immense, unnatural pressure. It's breaking! Pete screamed, pointing up at the twisting white box. The whole thing is twisting! August Watson stood frozen, staring up at his dream home as it warped grotesquely against the sky. The arrogance had finally vanished from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed, horrified realization that his money couldn't stop what was happening. The heavy left side swung wider. The lighter right side jerked violently in the opposite direction. The massive steel cables above it screamed, grinding against the lifting lugs as the load fought to find a center of gravity that simply didn't exist with this rigging setup. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on the twisting structure. The destructive power of physics was raw, terrifying, and absolute. And then, the yield point was reached. The final, catastrophic failure didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like a massive, sickening tear, like a giant bedsheet being ripped in half by a sudden, violent force. With a deafening crunch, the structural integrity of the entire 42,000-pound module gave way. The main load-bearing beam running the length of the module's floor snapped perfectly in half under the immense torsion. The heavy left side, the kitchen and bathroom, dropped another violent 2 feet. Jerking the entire structure downward, the white plastic weather wrap burst open, tearing in long, jagged strips, vomiting white drywall dust and insulation into the cold mountain air like a smoke grenade. Through the massive tear in the plastic, I could see the carnage inside. Entire sections of drywall had turned to powder. The custom kitchen cabinets, violently torqued from their moorings, were hanging sideways. I could hear the distinct musical crash of the large glass windows shattering inside the empty living room side. "Set it down!" August screamed, his voice cracking, a shrill sound of pure panic. "Set it down right now! Drop it! Drop it!" Donnie was frozen, staring up at the twisted, ruined box swaying violently above him. He had dropped his radio. "Mac, put it on the ground!" Pete yelled, grabbing his own radio. "Drop the load, right now." Inside the cab, Mac reacted with the speed of a seasoned professional. He didn't try to swing it over the foundation. He didn't try to place it gently back on the trailer. He just dropped the boom slightly and released the winch brake, bringing the massive broken module straight down into the deep mud of the staging area as fast as safely possible. Wham! The heavy left side of the module slammed into the earth first, driving 2 feet deep into the mud. The lighter right side crashed down a second later. The entire structure settled onto the ground, horribly contorted. It didn't look like a house anymore. It looked like a crushed cardboard box that a giant had stepped on. The roof was visibly caved in. The sides were bulging outward. Drywall dust continued to billow from the torn plastic wrap, all coating the entire staging area in a fine white powder. Then, there was silence. The heavy diesel engine of the crane idled loudly, but no one spoke. No one moved. The carpenters, Donnie's crew, Pete, and August Watson just stared at the ruined 42,000-pound pile of splinters sitting in the mud. I took a slow breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I looked at the twisted wreckage. I had tried to tell them. I had tried to explain the math. I looked at August Watson. He was trembling violently, his expensive designer boots coated in white drywall dust, staring at the shattered remains of his custom bathroom and living room. The reality of his arrogance was sitting in the mud, ruined beyond repair. I lowered my coffee thermos. The show was over. The silence following the crash was thick enough to choke on. It was the specific heavy quiet that only occurs when hundreds of thousands of dollars evaporate in less than 10 seconds. Drywall dust continued to drift over the muddy staging area like a localized snowstorm, settling over the hood of my F2-5. And dusting the shoulders of my canvas jacket. I didn't brush it off. I just stood behind the red safety tape, the thermos cooling in my hands, watching the tableau of absolute disaster. August Watson was the first to break the stillness, the shock wearing off, his face contorted from pale horror back to a violently flushed, pulsing red. He didn't look at the crushed module. He looked directly at the crane cab, then spun around to find a target closer to the ground. "What did you do?" August shrieked, his voice echoing shrilly off the surrounding pines. He lunged toward Donnie, and grabbing the young rigger by the front of his pristine, high-visibility vest. "What did you just do to my house?" Donnie was practically catatonic. His backward baseball cap had been knocked askew, and he was staring at the crumpled white box with eyes wide as saucers. I rigged it like you said. I hooked it up to the corners." "It twisted," August roared, spittle flying from his lips as he shook the 25-year-old. "You ripped my house in half, you incompetent little—" "Hey, let him go!" Pete yelled, finally springing to life. The foreman rushed forward, putting himself between the millionaire and the terrified kid. "August, back off. He's just a kid. You told him to lift it?" "He told me he knew what he was doing," August screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the wreckage. "Look at that. Look at it. Ness, the framing is snapped. The drywall is powder. Do you have any idea how much that custom kitchen cost?" "I know exactly how much it cost," Pete said, his voice surprisingly steady, though his hands were shaking. "And I know exactly why it's sitting in the mud right now." August whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto me, where I stood silently behind the perimeter tape. The realization of what had just happened, and who had tried to prevent it, seemed to hit him like a physical blow. But instead of contrition, his arrogance immediately mutated into desperate, flailing self-preservation. He marched toward the safety line, his designer boots sinking deep into the mud. He stopped just inches from the red tape, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "You!" August hissed, his chest heaving. "This is your fault. You set this up. You knew this would happen." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I told you exactly what was going to happen, Mr. Watson. Chapter and verse. I told you the center of gravity was heavily offset to the port side. I told you a standard square spreader frame would drop the heavy side. I told you that trying to adjust the cables manually in the air would cause massive torsion." "You sabotaged my site," August yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You refused to do your job so you could prove a point." "I refused to do my job because doing it your way violated basic safety protocols and the laws of physics," I replied calmly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet site. "I requested the adjustable modular spreader bar 3 weeks ago. You canceled the order to save $8,000. You fired me for refusing to perform an unsafe lift. You brought in a cheaper, inexperienced rigger, and you ordered him to lift an unbalanced load against his own hesitation." I lowered my thermos, locking eyes with the furious millionaire. "I didn't sabotage anything, Mr. Watson. I just stepped out of gravity's way." August's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled onto a dock. He looked around the site, desperately seeking an ally. He looked at Pete, the foreman. Pete shook his head slowly, looking at the ground. "Anthony is right, August. We all heard him warn you. We all heard you fire him. And we all heard you order Donnie to lift it." August spun toward the crane. Mac had climbed down from the cab and was walking over, a clipboard in his hand. He looked grim, but completely resolute. "I'm calling my lawyers!" August screamed at the veteran operator. "Your machine dropped my house. You're paying for this. Your insurance is going to cover every single dime." Mac stopped at the edge of the red tape, right beside me. He didn't look angry, he just looked tired. He held up his clipboard. "Mr. Watson, this is the daily lift plan. It requires the signature of the designated lift director before we boom up. Anthony Ward was the designated director. When you fired him, you verbally assigned the role to Donnie." Mac pointed a thick, calloused finger at the trembling young rigger. "Donnie gave me the signal to take the weight. When the load shifted, he gave me the signal to lift it higher and swing right. I executed the signals exactly as directed by your designated rigger. My crane didn't malfunction. The rigging failed to account for an offset center of gravity." Mac looked at August with eyes that had seen decades of construction site disasters. "My company isn't paying for a damn thing, Mr. Watson. In fact, I'm shutting the crane down for the day. We're going to need a structural engineer out here to assess if that module is even safe to approach to unhook the rigging." August looked back at the ruined 42,000-pound box. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating his armor of wealth and entitlement. The module wasn't just damaged, it was structurally compromised beyond repair. The main load-bearing beam was snapped. The custom cabinetry was crushed. The marble was shattered. "It can be fixed," August muttered, his voice dropping to a desperate, hollow whisper. He turned to Pete. We just need some jacks. We can shore up the broken beam. We can replace the drywall." Pete looked at his boss with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "August, the entire frame is torqued. If you try to lift that box again, it's going to fold in on itself like a cheap taco. The manufacturer is going to have to write this off as a total loss. They'll have to build a brand new module from scratch." August stared at the wreckage. "How long?" 4 months, Pete said quietly. "Maybe 6. And they aren't going to cover it under warranty, because we broke it on site. You're going to have to pay for the replacement out of pocket." August Watson, a man who believed he could control everything with a signature and a raised voice, slowly sank to his knees in the mud. He buried his face in his hands, the expensive fabric of his sweater completely ruined by the white drywall dust. I stood there for a few more moments, watching the millionaire kneel in the dirt before his shattered dream. There was no joy in what had happened. I take pride in my work. I hate seeing good materials destroyed, and I despise seeing a job site descend into chaos. But there was a profound, quiet satisfaction in the absolute, undeniable vindication of the moment. The universe has rules. They are written in mathematics, tension, and gravity. You can argue with a man, you can fire a contractor, but you cannot negotiate with a 42,000-pound asymmetrical load. I turned away from the wreckage and walked over to the tailgate of my F250. I screwed the cup back onto my thermos and tossed it into the cab. I did a final sweep of my gear, ensuring every shackle, sling, and clip was properly stowed in its designated toolbox. Mac walked over, leaning heavily against the side of my truck. "You headed out, Anthony?" "I am," I said, slamming the tailgate shut. "I'm officially unemployed for the rest of the day. Might go fishing?" Mac let out a low whistle, looking back at the kneeling figure of August Watson in the mud. "I've seen some expensive mistakes in my time, but watching a guy pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove he's smarter than a tape measure, That's a new one. It's an expensive lesson, I agreed, opening the driver's side door of my truck. But some guys only learn when it hurts their wallet. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The familiar, reliable rumble of the old V8 was a comforting sound against the quiet devastation of the site. Oh, I rolled down my window. Donnie, the young rigger, was walking slowly toward my truck. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped, his brand-new high-visibility vest coated in white dust. He stopped a few feet from my door, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Mr. Ward," Donnie said, his voice thick with shame. I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. He was yelling, and he said he'd pay me double my rate if I just got it done. I looked at the kid. He wasn't a bad guy. He was just young, inexperienced, and eager to please the wrong kind of person. "Donnie," I said firmly but not unkindly. "In this business, your reputation is built on the word no. When the math doesn't add up, you say no. When the gear isn't right, you say no. It doesn't matter who is writing the check or how loud they yell. Because when the load drops, gravity doesn't ask who signed the invoice. It just breaks whatever is underneath it." Donnie nodded slowly, wiping a smudge of dust from his face. "Yes, sir." "Go home, kid," I said. "Read up on calculating offset centers of gravity. You'll be a better rigger tomorrow than you were today." I put the truck in drive. As I slowly rolled past the red safety tape, I looked out the window one last time. August Watson was still kneeling in the mud, surrounded by the shattered, powdered remains of his arrogance. The massive white module sat twisted and broken, a monument to the absolute, unyielding laws of physics. I tapped the steering wheel to the rhythm of the radio, turned my truck down the mountain road, and drove away, leaving the millionaire alone with his gravity. We spend a lot of time in life worrying about the people who hold power over us, the bosses, the clients, the people who sign the checks. We let them push our boundaries, we let them rush our process, and sometimes we let them convince us to ignore our own expertise just to keep the peace. But true professional power isn't about arguing until you're blue in the face. It's about knowing your craft so intimately that when someone demands you compromise your standards, you can calmly say no, step back, and let them face the consequences of their own ignorance. You don't always have to fight the arrogant. Sometimes you just have to step behind the safety line and let the universe do the heavy lifting for you. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to step back and watch a disaster you tried to prevent? Tell me about it in the comments below.